Today we're going to talk about regulation, exciting topic. So we're going to talk about the regulatory environment facing Northeast agriculture producers. We sort of intuitively, if you asked producers in the Northeast, they're going to tell you that the Northeastern regulatory environment is highly regulated compared to other parts of the country. And we were approached a couple years ago by Farm Credit East and want us to actually take a sort of a quantitative look at that to see is the Northeast more regulated than other parts of the country. So what we want to do is we want to sort of understand the business climate, especially with respect to agricultural business climate, and understand from a producer their perceptions as well as from sort of a more objective index measure what's happening in the Northeast. So what we want to do today is, and what we want to do in the study was sort of summarize the state regulations pertaining to agricultural regulations in the Northeast. We want to survey agricultural producers and get their perceptions of the regulatory environment and develop an index. And the index trying to look at ranking states on their regulations with respect to agriculture. And then we want to put in some comparison states to understand exactly how does the Northeast compare to the comparison states that we had chosen in conjunction with Farm Credit East. So what we know is there's been a bunch of studies come out here in the last several years, even prior to that say that the business climate in the Northeast is horrible. The study by CNBC put the Northeast is highly regulated and highly unfavorable to business. Then you had the Economist came out in 2014 with another study that basically did the same thing, showing that Northeast is not favorable, not a business-friendly climate. There's been other studies. There's one recently came out a couple months ago that did the same thing. I can't remember who did the study, but again, Northeast very unfavorable to the businesses in the area compared to other parts of the country. So we started looking at these studies to try to figure out where does Northeast rank. And what you see is that generally the Northeast, they don't rank in the top 10 of business friendliness or in subsidies. So if you think subsidies are good, you know, the northeastern states really do not do well in that vein. I think 1 of 9 states received a ranking of C or higher in comparison to 6 out of 12 Midwestern states. So we don't do well when you rank states, and we don't do well when you grade states. The Northeast generally has this perception and this sort of reality, if you trust indexes, that it's highly regulated and not friendly to business. There's been another number of surveys that have tried to look at this agricultural part of it. In 2000, there was one looking at forestry in the Northeast, another one on national small business owners. Regulation-wise, Hurley in 2005 looked at agricultural commissioners in California to try to figure out exactly the regulation burden in the state. So what you see with all these surveys is they're somewhat subjective, but they're trying to be quantitative with respect to give an accurate perception of what's happening in the states and various industries and various components of the ag sector and business in general. A number of different ways have gone about to try to understand and describe how these business climates and regulations are perceived and how they're ranked. We've had everything from descriptive statistics, index rankings. Index rankings are highly, I'd say, controversial, given that sort of what goes in depends on what you get out. So if your state does really well, then everyone's happy. If your state does really bad, then people aren't happy. So it's sort of this mixed bag of what goes in, what you get out. We've had other statistical measures to try to understand what is going on with respect to business and agriculture in the Northeast and throughout the country. What we find generally is that larger and more Republican firms perceive taxes to be unfair. Larger firms show a more positive view in revenue and employment growth. Age has been an impact factor. Sort of for what we're looking at of interest is what are the sort of areas within regulation are important. We continually find that environmental, labor, food safety, land use, those types of things are the things that come up over and over and over again as being important areas for policies. So that's sort of what we focused on and we did the index part of the study, and even in the survey, producer survey. Regulatory attributes, number, complexity, and cost of regulations, and dealing with number of agencies has been cited as being important. Everything from equity and effectiveness of regulations. We've had studies that looked at the agriculture-urban interface. So there's a whole bunch of things that are going on around this regulation and business climate component that we're going to try to grapple with and try to understand and try to get a complete picture of what's happening in the Northeast. So what we did was we wanted to survey agricultural producers. If we come up with an index, it's all well and good, but we want to know. So we were talking about the symposium yesterday, and then the keynote this morning, the panel. Perception matters. So we want to understand what are agricultural producers, what is their perception of the regulatory climate in the Northeast. What we want to do in the survey, we want to look at sort of what type of general characteristics are the production that's ongoing in these firms, and also we want to look at things like sales. Are you growing? Is your business growing? Those types of things to understand what is happening with the firms that we're surveying, so we can get an understanding of does regulation apply to certain farms more than others. With respect to the produce show, we want to look at do you produce fruit and vegetables versus livestock versus other commodities to try to understand is there a difference in these different groups. With respect to the regulatory areas of concern, like I mentioned, look at land use, environmental, labor, business, taxes, transportation, food safety, and incentives. All these things come up over and over and over again. No matter what survey you look at, what study, generally these are the areas that come up as being important and that people or businesses are concerned about. So what we did was we created an online survey. The reason we did that was some of these farms would not give us their mailing lists. So for instance, Farm Credit East, they're not going to let us know their membership list. They're not going to give us their list and say, hey, mail all our people. They won't give us their emails and say, email other people. But what they'll do is say, give us the survey link, and we'll send it to all of our members. So we did an online survey where we put these questions in. We went through Farm Credit East. We had farm credit agencies to send it out to their members, state farm bureaus, state agricultural associations. Any avenue we could get out there, try to get the survey out to get it feedback and get respondents. Questions we're really interested in with respect to this part of the sort of the perceptions, and for the state where you have your primary farming activities, how do you view your state's regulatory environment for agricultural activities? So we want to know, do you think you're over or under regulated with respect to your overall environment? And then we ask specifically for each subsector, so for land, for environment, for labor, taxes, all those things, how do you view your regulatory environment? And then we went in and we said, okay, being an economist, we have to give nice big long models. Well, here's mine, where we use the model to try to understand if someone said they were over or under regulated, what are the characteristics that make and explain that, right? So maybe if you're a fruit and vegetable grower, do you think you're more or less under or over-regulated compared to other groups, other commodity groups? So then after that, we were really interested in saying, okay, if you said you're over-regulated in an area, let's say if you said you were over-regulated or under-regulated, then you were sent another question. And in that question, you were asked sort of what areas do you think you were over or under-regulated in? So now we can get an idea of, okay, the overall general perception of regulation, but also the more specific, do you think environment is where you're over-regulated or under-regulated, down to transportation, food safety, and those type of issues, okay? So that's what the survey was really focusing on, what was going on. Then we did sort of more modeling to understand what are the demographics that might explain someone who says that they're over-regulating environmental aspects. Can we try to understand, is it a business function of the business type they're in with respect to what they produce? Is it the size of the business, the age of the business, the growth of the business, those type of areas? All right, so this gives you an idea of sort of what happened in the survey. On the top left, the left-hand side, I guess it'd be, yeah, your left-hand side, principal operators gives you an idea of sort of how many agricultural operators there are by state. And on the right-hand side, we have sort of how well our survey did. So we came close to New York. 35% of our surveys came from there. We were underrepresented probably in New Hampshire and Connecticut. Overrepresented in New Hampshire, Connecticut, underrepresented in New Jersey and Maine. For whatever reason, we had a really hard time getting people out of New Jersey to take the survey. I don't know why. We got a fair amount, but it was 22, but it was really hard. We pushed and pushed and pushed. We just could not get New Jersey producers to fill out the survey. By sector, fruits and vegetables was by far the most frequented profession, or the commodity that the producer said they were doing, and all the way down to timber and aquaculture. So, we feel fairly good. It's one of those things where it's an internet survey where you're sending out, sort of we get what you get. I mean, it's the best we could do. We pushed and pushed to try to get. We roughly had around 700 responses to the survey, which we thought was quite good. We were giving no incentives other than please do this 20-minute survey, right? And so if anyone's done surveys, it's hard to get people to do surveys, especially when they're long and sort of in depth of telling us information about how you feel about things and information about your business. So generally, sort of idea of what our survey looked like. Roughly half were sole proprietorships. We had a sort of fairly even divide amongst age. Sales, mainly firms that were less than $100,000 in total sales. So when we look at what's happening in ag industry, we see that generally you're seeing big and small firms. The medium-sized guys are going away. So we're not getting the big guys filling out the survey. We're getting the more smaller groups where generally firms are tending to be now. And we had generally 67% of respondents perceived sales have increased since 2010. And you have other sort of indicators of what's happening to the individual businesses and what's going on. Years of experience, relative even shares across how long people have been in business. Gender, we had 70% male. Age, a lot over 50 years of age. So we saw that business-wise, for our survey sample, that generally the amount of time someone had been in business was evenly split, but generally they were over 50 years of age, the people doing the surveys. So they just give an idea that, is this representative? You know, I don't know. It's hard to really get a grasp of what exactly representative is for this industry, these industries, but we think we made a best effort to try to get a wide sample of producers and various industries to understand what's happening. So now it's sort of what's happening regulatory environment-wise. What you'll see in the table is sort of, we asked, how do you feel about regulation since 2010? Has it decreased, unchanged, or increased since 2010 on these variety of subsectors? So for instance, 57% said land use regulations have increased since 2010. Okay, that seems like a lot, but when you look at something like food safety, where you're 75%, or environmental 70%, you see that some areas are saying that there's a perception that some of these areas are actually becoming more regulated compared to other areas, right? So the perception is they're all moving towards regulation, more regulation, but some areas are doing it in a higher rate across producers. All right. Trends and sort of what's happening and how much time and effort, money has been spent on regulations, how to adapt. 67% had said that the time they have to spend on state regulatory burden has increased since 2010. We're really focusing in on state because everyone, if it's federal regulation, all producers are sort of under the same mandate for federal, so that should sort of have the same burdens. State, you'll find that that's where the big impact is coming. So roughly they're saying the amount of time producers are having to spend on these regulations is increasing compared to 2010. The same things with the amount of money that's being spent. So you're not only spending more time, you're spending more money to have to deal with all the regulations that are out there for what's aggregated across our producers in the Northeast. But we're interested, as we talked about federal state, we see that what's really the big thing that's of influence on your farming practices, municipal regulations really aren't that big of a deal. State and federal are the two big areas where you're finding the most regulation having an impact, with state having more impact than federal regulations. So state is really where the big differences are coming from with respect to, and at least to sort of why this is important, the study is important, that state regulations are what are really impacting farming production practices, especially in the Northeast. So to me, it's interesting to understand not only how do you feel about your state, but to understand how do you feel about other states. And what we generally see in this is that the grass seems to be greener on the other side. So in general, states believe that their regulations were harsher, or they had more regulations than the surrounding states. Two differences, maybe in New Hampshire and Vermont. Everybody loved Vermont and New Hampshire. Those states came across very well. Everybody wants to move there because they're unregulated. But for the most part, you see that a state such as New York, on a scale of 1 to 5, put their regulations at 3.22 on the 5-point scale, with 5 being really highly regulated. They put all the other states at 3.01. So you see this, that states, generally people have this, that other states are less regulated than my state. So what we want to try to do is a little bit of part of this is to, in our index, we'll talk about in a little while, is that sort of perception versus reality, are they the same across states? What we really saw was New Jersey really thought other states, New Jersey and Mass, thought they were really highly regulated and really thought other states were getting a pass, right? So if you look at Massachusetts, 3.52 on how regulated their state was compared to 2.53 on how other states were. So a full point on the Likert scale of other states versus their state. Same thing in New Jersey, is that you see this difference that they really think other states are not nearly as burdened compared to the state they're in. So being an economist, I've got to show you a big table full of numbers you can't read. Well, here's my table, one of many tables. So what this table is basically showing is if you said you have an unfavorable regulatory environment, what are the characteristics that we might could say would lead you to, that might explain that decision? So if you're from New Jersey, compared to Connecticut, being from Connecticut, we had to use Connecticut as a base. If you're from New Jersey, you said that your regulatory environment was worse than Connecticut. All right? If you were general proprietorship compared to corporation, you again said you were unfavorable regulatory environment. So this gives an idea of sort of what those firms are, that the characteristics of the firms that are having these, that think they have these unfavorable regulations. What we don't see is anything with commodity groups. So fruit and vegetables said they were not more or less favorable compared to field crops or timber or livestock. All right. So if we look at favorable, again, you have Vermont. If you're from Vermont, again, you thought you were sitting pretty with respect to regulation-wise. Again, you have, if you're less than 10 years of farming experience, you thought you had favorable regulatory environment, which is sort of contrary to what we expect. And what we've heard anecdotally is that if people don't come into farming because it's highly regulated, well, this generally shows that those who have less than 10 years generally are not seeing, they don't think there's unfavorable as other groups, right? And so that may placate to the groups that have been around for 30 years, 40 years, that have seen regulation change. They think they're more worse for now because they've been around longer. They've seen things get from no regulations to highly regulated. Regulatory environment-wise, again, here it goes back to state-wise, how many people, what percentage thought they were regulated, under-regulated, sort of accurate versus overly regulated. If you look at New Jersey, 95% thought they were over-regulated. So granted, we didn't have a big response rate from New Jersey, but still, 95% thought they were over-regulated. Compared to Vermont, where only 35% thought they were over-regulated. So you see differences that sort of align with these state perceptions about what one state is versus another state. Likelihood producers receive regulatory burden. 70% of fruit and vegetable growers thought they were over-regulated. If you compare that to, say, aquaculture and timber, which was 80%. But you see for crop-wise, it's generally in the same realm of percentages. You don't see wide differences here. So we see it state-wise, we see differences of regulation perceptions, but commodity-wise, generally we don't see that much differences there of that one industry is being affected more than another industry. Environmental, so we go back to those subsectors. So environmental, we see that if you're from New York compared to Connecticut, you think that you're over-regulated with respect to environmental regulations. Women, that if you're a women operator, primary operator, that you thought environmental regulations you were over-regulated. So we see that there are some differences both firm-wise and state-wise of environmental regulations. And why is it interesting? Why do I bring up environmental businesses, business taxes, and labor? Because it's sort of leading into this index we're going to do at the end, where I'm going to talk about sort of the rankings we have, and you'll see that states bounce around in those rankings. For business taxes, if you're from Maine, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, relative to Connecticut, you thought you were over-regulated. So we see, in general, Vermont shows up as the perception it is not highly regulated, but for business tax-wise, it shows up as producers from Vermont perceive that, hey, business taxes may be an area where we actually do have some over-regulation. You look at less than 10 yards of farming, again, show up the taxes and fees, and that may be getting into business. Those things are highly regulated with the aspect of having to pay taxes and fees to get into business. Labor regulations, we see a lot of things contributing to that. Again, New York. If you're New York, you compare to Connecticut, labor regulations were something that came up as why you were overregulated. Livestock sector versus field crops, labor was the issue there. We don't see it with those areas that are really, I would say, that are really highly labor intensive, fruit and vegetables and green industry, greenhouse nursery. We don't see those firms saying that labor regulations are a big issue. Again, we see the other things such as education for the person doing the survey or the prior, farm profitability as well. Those issues also come up as indicating or helping to explain why someone would say they're overregulated. Land use, New Jersey and Vermont. So the other thing compared to Connecticut of why someone would think they're overregulated. Again, number of years that you've been in business is another thing that's sort of this land use regulation, overregulation. So I'm presenting these fast just to give you an idea of that there's changing demographics, there's changing business characteristics, and there are changing states of how people are sort of viewing themselves as being over or underregulated. Transportation regulations. Here's where we see the fruit and vegetable sector actually have some impact. So compared to field crops, the fruit and vegetable sector believe that transportation regulations are overly burdensome compared to the field crop and commodity group. And then also Vermont again shows up transportation. So overall, Vermont's not seen as highly regulated, but when we get to some of these individual areas, they show up in, with respect to being overly regulated. Food safety, we have fruit and vegetables show up again, and livestock, specialty crop, compared to field crops. So food safety in this realm, which is probably especially like for fruit and vegetable, you're showing up that, I mean, if you're processing, we've had a lot of people talk about going from lettuce to salads and things like that, that if you're in this doing this, that food safety now becomes more and more of an issue, so food safety might become more and more of an issue compared to other commodity groups, especially field crops. Again, we have different sales levels, different firm characteristics that are sort of indicating what types of firms are saying they're experiencing these overregulation in the food safety areas. Overregulated by state, so this gives you a sort of a synopsis of what's going on in graphical form. So environment, New York, New Jersey are saying they're overregulated. Business taxes, New York, New Jersey again. Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire saying really no overregulation. Labor, New York, land use, New Jersey. So you see these things start to come up down the bottom table. You'll see by sector that you see like for fruit and vegetables, and especially food safety is an issue. So you see that sort of there are a lot of things going in this that are making that drive how people feel about their regulation environment. So what do we find basically for what do we find for the producer survey? Farmer experience and farm age tend to impact perceptions. Environmental and labor regulations perceived overregulated by some states, food safety by other states, taxes and transportation bounce around. And this is what we're going to see in the index as well. Some states do really well in our index on food safety with respect to being not overregulated. Some states do very poorly. And then for business taxes, you'll see that state who did poorly in food safety now up at the top of, and then we sort of moving around. All right, so that's a sort of, this is mirroring what we're seeing. The perception of producers sort of mirrors what we're finding in the index. In general, though, New Jersey, which you'll find interesting here compared to what we see in a minute, New Jersey is perceived to be more regulated compared to Vermont, which is less regulated. In agricultural sector and business sector, it has some effect on specific regulations, subsectors of regulations, but overall, really, the industry commodity group, your commodity you're selling, this really doesn't impact you. You're thinking pretty much along the same lines overall, perception-wise, of regulations. What we want to look, we got a ton of data. We're going to be looking at both new and experienced farmers. Look at that and how regulations impact those. Limitations of the farm. We have sources of knowledge. What types of programs are people using? And so we're going to be looking at sort of do certain firms that use these governmental programs. How do they feel about regulation? So we have a whole lot of data to use to look at a lot of different issues with respect to regulation and program usage at the state level. Now the fun part, right? Because no matter what I say here, some of you are going to shake your head, okay, I agree, and some of you are going to say, oh, that's not good, that's garbage, all right? Because it depends on what you think. If you think what we put in this index matters or not, right? So we talked about tax, labor, environmental, and sort of sector-specific variables that might influence regulations. So as I said earlier, we went through and we took the regulations of each state. We took surveys that had already been done on business climate and other agricultural surveys, and we tried to pull out what types of regulations within taxes would be something that we should have in our index. So that's sort of how we went about putting this index together, is to look at other surveys, other past things that have gone on, and use that as a springboard to define our index. So we had a tax category, labor, environmental, and sector specific. Within non-policy, we had, it shouldn't be tax, labor, environmental. Non-policy, we had things like weather. We had sort of more business climate areas that were going in this non-policy area. So, for instance, sales tax rate, personal income tax, corporate income tax. Within this, we not only use the rate, but a lot of times we try to quantify and value the complexity of the taxes. So if you had 557 different categories within corporate income tax, you're probably more complex than if you had 5 categories. So we try to put some kind of bounds on and some kind of categories, quantitative measure on not only what is your rate, but also how complex is it. Inheritance tax. So not only do you have a tax rate, but also the inheritance tax complexity. So all these things to try to understand what's the complexity within tax, sort of tax structure of the state. For labor, we looked at like workman's comp, unemployment, minimum wage, agricultural overtime, and we also the adverse effects wage rate, which is actually given by the federal government, but it gives an idea of sort of the cost of doing business in the state, so it's a little bit more of a business climate index. For environmental, what are the fees for pesticide applicator fees, water permit cost, carbon intensity of the economy. Carbon intensity of the economy has been shown to have sort of a value on the complex regulation structure of a state. So we put that in there. Federal state environmental voting history. You might ask, why do we put something about voting history in there? Well, if your state always votes yes on environmental issues, good or bad, it may mean that you're voting yes on environmental regulations, right? We use federal level because it gives us easy to control for, it takes out the state effect with respect to, you made 557 bills in Connecticut and 25 in New York, and so it's hard to sort of say if you voted yes, no, and how, based on the voting. We know at federal level, pretty much you were able to vote on the same bills, and it gives us sort of this consensus of how does your state feel about voting on environmental issues. And this, we're not the first to do this. This has been used time and time again. Then we have total farm conservation easement acreage. For sector specific, we have things like feed product registration fees, lime product registration fees, food safety laws, those type of things to understand, is there something that's sector specific that may be outside the general tax realm or the environmental realm or land use realm. This maybe is more specific to get an idea of how you're treating individual sort of commodity groups. Non-policy, again, these are more things like business climate. We have industrial prices for electricity, land rent, state credit rating, state direct expenditures, total airports, miles of railroad, temperature, and participation. All these things are really not regulatory per se, but they generally have a business climate. Right, so they go into that factor in that. So we want to look at the actual agricultural, regulatory, and business environment in the Northeast. We need to have policy and non-policy factors in there. So now the fun part. This is the overall index ranking for New England. Anybody see anything that they find a little bit out? So in this case, 1 we find is the least regulated, and 8 is the most regulated. Anybody find anything they see that jumps out at them that might go, that doesn't look right? All my New Jersey people left. New Jersey came as so caveat, this is not saying someone's overregulated or underregulated. We're just saying that when we rank the states, in our case, New Hampshire was more overregulated than New Jersey in our rankings, right? That's what we're saying, okay? So Vermont did well, Massachusetts well, Connecticut, New York, you start seeing these things that we expect. New Hampshire, which we thought, in Maine, we thought would be higher. They're towards the bottom of regulation. But New Jersey's the one that sticks out. All right? It comes in, we find it's the least regulated of the northeastern states. You know, and what we did was, and so to explain what we did was we did all these sectors and subsectors. We simulated them 10,000 times with different weights. And what you see is that little red bar is sort of the confidence interval around those simulations to give an idea of, because we see that some people in some of the surveys have done that they'll weight environmental at 70%, and maybe food safety at 20%, and others at 10%. So that gives sort of an unbalanced sort of flavor of how things are going. Because what if environmental should be 20% and food safety is 70%? So we simulate this 10,000 times on these different weights, and so the bar gives you an idea that no matter how we simulate it, New Jersey kept coming out on top with respect to the index we created. You can argue about do we put the right things in there? That's an argument we can have, but for what we put in, we find New Jersey came out as the least regulated. Policy-wise, so this is just those policy factors. This is taxes, environmental, labor, those guys. It's not the non-policy, which is the weather and things like that. New Jersey did really, really well. So if you break it down into groups, we may have 3 groups. We have New Jersey, then we have the second tier, be Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Then we have Connecticut, Maine, and New York. As we saw in the perceptions of the producers, New York did really bad. Well, they did really bad in the policy thing here. So other than New Jersey, which seems to be this thing we can't explain, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm not saying it's right, but if we say that Vermont is number 2 and Rhode Island and New Hampshire move towards the top, and we expect New York to be at the bottom, that gives us confidence that we're doing something right. Why did New Jersey come out on top as far as the least regulated? It may be a function of our index, but it is what it is. Tax policy-wise, New York did well in tax policy compared to other states. In this case, New Jersey actually fell to 5th. Rhode Island was towards the bottom. So we see that things start moving around. So if we have taxes versus environmental, those things, states move. What New Jersey did really well was they were towards the top on most all. Where you may have New York was top on one or towards the top on one, and they were towards the bottom on the rest. Connecticut was in the middle for everything. New Jersey consistently stayed not at the bottom, but towards the top. So that's probably why they did really well, was because in our index, they stayed near the top and they weren't really punished by anything. Labor policy, New Jersey's at the top with Maine. New York, again, towards the bottom. So we still see New York, this overregulation thing happening. Rhode Island, Connecticut, again, towards the bottom. And this is for those labor factors. Environmental, New Jersey and New Hampshire up top. We see New York, again, towards the bottom. Connecticut towards the middle. Vermont, New Hampshire, again, at the top. So we see states moving around. So if you take anything from this, it's not a one-size-fits-all. In the report, which I put the link up, you'll find that we give recommendations for every state with respect to, you may have done really well in this, but you can improve on this to help agriculture. Sector policy index, so this is that sector, sort of this very variable group of variables we thought were important. Rhode Island did well. You see New Jersey towards the top, Connecticut towards the top, Maine, New Hampshire, those guys really towards the bottom with respect to how they fell in the rankings. Non-policy wise, you have sort of a top group: New Jersey, Vermont, Mass, and New York. The worst group, if you want to say worse, Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Those guys sort of fall towards the bottom in the non-policy realm. So this is weather. This is electricity rates. If you live in Connecticut, electricity is expensive. So you have those type things that are sort of making up this index for non-policy. So this is putting up an overall index ranking for our states versus the 9 comparable states. What you find, really quickly looking at the overall index, is we find what all these other things have shown on business climate. With respect to agriculture specific, I think roughly only one state fell out of the, most of the bottom states are northeastern states. New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut. Vermont and New Jersey are the only 2 that sort of slipped out of that bottom tier. So by and large, we're not doing well compared to comparable states. Right? So if we take maybe New Jersey out and sort of say, okay, that case we can't quite explain how they did so well, by and large, the Northeast comes out as being highly regulated compared to other states. Why does that matter? Well, from a business perspective, it matters because you're in a climate that now you're competing against farms from California, you're competing against farms from the Midwest, you're competing against all these farms to sell your products. If you have more regulations, that's an issue, if they're costing you. Policy index, again, we see the bottom states, again, come out to be generally the New England states with just looking at the policy realm. If we go non-policy, again, same story. The New England states, no matter what we do, fall towards the bottom on the rankings of the 16 states. So if we look at overall, if we look at policy, non-policy, New England generally falls towards the bottom. And so when we do this, if you want to see the report's online, and I can send you the links. We go in detail in the report about exactly what's going on with respect to recommendations for each state. We talk about more in detail the survey, how we did that, and the index, how we came up with that. But I mean, by and large, we saw what has been told to us over and over again. We sort of find that certain states, such as Vermont and Rhode Island in general sometimes, but Vermont especially, do really well. We saw other states that we're generally told are highly regulated doing not so well. New York especially. The one thing we can't explain, and I don't know if we need to explain, is New Jersey. I don't know, I mean, if you trust the other results are right, then you've got to trust that New Jersey's right as well. Right? So you can't say New Jersey's wrong and everything else is wrong. So you've got to, it's either we did okay with our index and sort of met what we expected, or we did bad and everything's wrong. So it's sort of, sort of either or, you can't say both. So that's what we did. We took this index and we tried to come up with sort of how do perceptions and reality sort of mirror each other. Just because our sort of New Jersey evaluations don't align across the board, it's something to sort of delve more deeper in to try to understand. But by and large, I think we sort of came up with it in general. The New England states or the northeastern states are highly regulated compared to the comparable states around the country. So with that, I'll take questions. I know I threw a lot at you. Questions? The question is comparable states. So there are two realms that we did this. Farm Credit East, and I don't know if you know what Farm Credit East is. It's a major lending institution in the Northeast. They came up and said, we want you to look at these states. And they were looking, I think, at the size of ag in some of those states and how it compared to New England states. So we took that list and said, we're not 100% sure that that's the comparable states we need to look at. So when we created 4 or 5 other states that we thought were more in line with the types of production in New England. So a state that had a purely livestock probably wasn't something we would say would be our comparable states. And so we tried to sort of match production practices. And so we had this mix of sort of sales-wise and production practice-wise to get a comparable list, right? So California is not a comparable state, right? So they were out. So we try to get sort of same size, same production, same types of sales to sort of get these comparables.
Hello. It's working now.
It's working.
Other questions for Ben?
Thank you, Ben, for a great presentation. How did you come up with the index? Is there a weight in the different categories, or could you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so what we did was the way we came up with the categories was talking to Farm Credit East and other producers. We also went through past surveys that have been done to try to get a gauge of what other people have done. And then it comes up with this weighting issue. How do you weight? Other surveys have generally assigned weights, 50 equal weighting across the board for these categories, or they've said, okay, we believe food safety is this, and so to sort of combat that, we said let's just run simulations. So we went in and we ran 10,000 simulations to try to get so in one case food safety may have been 0%, and next one food safety was 100%. So we did that, and then we put the confidence intervals on it to try to get an idea of what sort of the range was around sort of our estimates. So that's what we did. So we didn't definitely assign this is the weight. We said let's do some kind of simulation-based thing to understand sort of what's the range if we assign it different weights.
Ben, just a quick question here. So the New Jersey guys that responded to the survey, do you know if they're mainly produce or if they're field crops, or because the ones that I work with, they're mainly fruits and vegetables, and the response would have been completely the opposite of what you were showing if just talking to them.
Yeah.
So
as far as whether it's different between the perception part or the index part.
The index?
Yeah, and so that's the only thing with the response we've gotten is, well, New Jersey's New Jersey's wrong. But then it's okay. Then it's New York's right, and then Vermont's right. Well, okay, well, fine. You can't say one state's wrong and all the other states are right. So I would say sort of New Jersey's a mix. We didn't have, for the producer survey, we had a low response rate. Roughly, we had 95% saying that of the New Jersey producers saying that they were overregulated. So that's more in line with what you're saying. We just can't explain this New Jersey thing. And maybe we picked just the right variables that put everything right for every other state that our expectation. But New Jersey somehow, I don't know what the answer is. All I know is, index-wise, we came up with New Jersey doing fairly well because they did well across the board. There was nothing. New York did bad on a lot of things. Connecticut did bad on a lot of things, but did good on some stuff. New Jersey sort of did toward a top tier. They weren't the best on everything, but they weren't the worst. So that's where you see, especially the overall ratings, is New Jersey wasn't hurt because they were the worst. They were middle to top tier on everything. So.
Any other questions? Ben Campbell from the University of Connecticut.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.